My name is Clara, and I am telling this story now from the comfort of a life I built myself, a life I was never meant to have. The memories feel like a novel I once read, filled with gaslit ballrooms and the scent of jasmine and terror. I never imagined that the same London season that introduced me to a man of quiet, unshakable honor would also be the one that ended with my sale as a piece of property, a transaction orchestrated by my own half-brother. And I certainly never dreamed that the honorable man, a diplomat bound by the strictest codes of conduct, would be the one to shatter every rule and risk a war to pull me from the gilded cage where I was left to perish. He tore down an empire of protocol for one person he barely knew, and in doing so he taught me that a person's true worth is not what their family assigns them, but what they are willing to fight for. Before I dive into the heart of this impossible story, the heist that should have failed, and the cruelty that nearly broke me, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever felt utterly betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you, please hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. For all the new viewers here, make sure you subscribe because this is a community for survivors, and your story matters here too. My world had always been one of subtle fractures and carefully polished surfaces. I grew up in a London townhouse that was grand on the outside, but cold and hollow within. My mother, my father's first wife, had died when I was very young, leaving behind only a faint scent of lavender in her old rooms, and a single precious locket with her miniature painted inside. My father, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced with jelly, remarried quickly. His new wife, Beatrice, was a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper smile, and she brought with her a son, Julian, who was 5 years my senior. From the moment they crossed the threshold, I became a ghost in my own home. I was the living, breathing reminder of a previous, and by all accounts happier, marriage. Beatrice and Julian never let me forget it. My education was deemed a frivolous expense, my opinions an unwelcome intrusion, and my presence a constant, low-grade irritation. I was the unpaid, unloved governess to myself, the quiet girl who faded into the wallpaper, existing only to be a contrast to Julian's brilliance. And oh, how Julian shone! He was handsome, charming, and possessed a talent for cruelty that he disguised as playful teasing. He knew exactly which words would slice the deepest, which dreams of mine were fragile enough to crush with a single careless boot heel. When I was 14, he found me sketching in my room, a charcoal drawing of a ship sailing for a distant, sun-drenched shore. He held it up, a smirk playing on his lips. "Still dreaming of escape, little mouse?" he'd asked, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Before I could answer, he'd torn it neatly in half, then into quarters, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. "There are no ships for you, Clara," he had said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Only this house. You should learn to be grateful for its walls." That was Julian. He didn't just want to clip your wings, he wanted you to thank him for it. My father, lost in his ledgers and his quiet desperation to please his new family, saw none of it, or perhaps he chose not to see. His approval was a currency Julian had a monopoly on, while I was left with a deficit I could never hope to repay. Days were spent in quiet servitude, fetching Beatrice's shawls, tidying Julian's messes, and enduring the endless, draining comparisons. Julian was to inherit everything. I was to be married off to the first bidder who could tolerate my morose disposition, as Beatrice so generously put it. My only solace was the world of books. In the dusty, neglected library, I traveled to places I would never see, met people who valued intelligence over inheritance, and learned about a world far larger than the suffocating confines of Belgravia. It was there I developed a fascination with the Ottoman Empire, not for its exoticism, but for its complex history, its art, and its sheer, sprawling otherness. It felt like the furthest place from my cold, gray reality. That fascination, that private little hobby, would turn out to be a thread of the most terrible and beautiful irony in the tapestry of my life. The night I met Lord Alistair Finch was an accident, a deviation from the carefully scripted misery of my existence. Beatrice had insisted I attend a diplomatic ball, not out of kindness, but as a form of subtle punishment. She dressed me in a drab, ill-fitting gown of slate gray, a color designed to make me disappear. "You mustn't outshine the other, more promising young ladies," she'd said, patting a stray hair into place with a look of profound satisfaction. I was her drab little sparrow, meant to highlight the peacocks. As the orchestra swelled and the ballroom glittered with diamonds and ambition, I did as I was designed to do. I vanished. I found refuge in a small, dimly lit conservatory, the air thick with the scent of orchids and damp earth. I was tracing the veins on a fern leaf when a voice, calm and measured, spoke from behind me. "An Asplenium nidus, the bird's nest fern. It prefers humidity to direct conversation." I turned, startled, to see a man who seemed as out of place as I felt. He wasn't one of the dashing young lords or the pompous elder statesmen. He was of an indeterminate age, perhaps late 30s, with a face that was more interesting than handsome, etched with lines of thought and concentration. His posture was ramrod straight, his suit impeccably tailored but utterly devoid of flourish. This was a man who did not believe in wasting a single motion or word. This, I would learn, was Lord Alistair Finch, a rising star in the Foreign Office, known for his encyclopedic knowledge and his almost monastic dedication to protocol. He saw the book on Ottoman art I'd tucked under my arm, a book I'd smuggled from the library for a moment's peace. Instead of the polite, dismissive comment I expected, his eyes lit with a flicker of genuine interest. "Iznik pottery," he stated, not asked. "A fascinating period. The transition from the traditional arabesque to more naturalistic floral motifs. Do you have a preferred style?" I was so taken aback by a question that assumed I had a preference, an opinion worth hearing, that I stammered for a moment. But he waited, patient and still, his gaze direct and serious. Finding my voice, I spoke of the vibrant cobalt blues, the intricate tulip designs that felt so full of life. We didn't talk about the weather, or the ball, or the latest society gossip. We spoke of the architecture of the Suleymaniye Mosque, of the political intricacies of the Sublime Porte, of the poetry of Rumi. For 20 minutes, in that quiet, humid conservatory, I wasn't the drab little sparrow. I was a person with a mind, and he was listening. He never smiled, not in the conventional sense, but there was a warmth in his attention, a deep and abiding respect in the way he considered my words before offering his own. When Julian finally found me, his face a mask of irritation, Alistair's expression became utterly unreadable. "Clara, for heaven's sake, stop hiding in the shrubbery," Julian had sneered. "You're making a scene by your absence." I mumbled an apology, my cheeks burning with shame. Alistair simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Miss Hemlock," he said, his voice betraying nothing. "It was an honor." And then he was gone, swallowed back into the glittering throng, leaving me with the bewildering memory of being seen. That brief conversation became a secret talisman, a proof that the person I was in the library was real. It was a memory I would cling to in the darkness that was to come, a single candle against a hurricane. The end of my life in London began with my brother's debts. Julian lived a life of expensive excess, funded by an allowance he always outspent, and IOUs he never intended to honor. His gambling had become a ravenous beast, and its appetite was threatening to consume the family's finances. I knew this only from whispers between my father and stepmother, hushed, angry conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. One evening, a guest came to dinner. He was not English, he was a man named Pasha Murad, an Ottoman dignitary visiting London on a trade mission. He was older, with eyes like polished obsidian that seemed to see everything and value nothing. He was draped in fine silks, and the air around him smelled of tobacco and cloves. Julian was effusively charming to him, laughing too loudly at his jokes, pouring his wine with a trembling hand. The Pasha's gaze swept over me at the dinner table, lingering for a moment too long. It was not a look of admiration. It was the look of a collector appraising a piece of porcelain. I felt a chill crawl up my spine and quickly looked down at my plate. I did not understand then that I was the currency in a transaction that had already been negotiated. A week later, Julian announced my good fortune. A wonderful opportunity had arisen. A respectable English family, living near Smyrna, required a governess for their young children. It would be an adventure, a chance for me to see the world, to make something of myself. He presented it as an act of profound brotherly generosity. Beatrice was positively beaming. "Think of it, Clara. The Mediterranean sun. It will do wonders for your pale complexion." My father, his eyes refusing to meet mine, mumbled something about it being a fine character-building experience. A small, cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. Why so far? Why so sudden? But to question it was to be ungrateful. To refuse was to be a burden. I packed a small trunk, my heart a confusing mix of terror and a desperate, flickering hope that this might, after all, be an escape. The night before I was to leave, I tried to speak to my father. I found him in his study, staring into the fireplace. "Father," I began, my voice small, "are you certain of this family? Do you know them?" He flinched, turning to me with a haunted look in his eyes. "Julian has assured me they are of the highest caliber," he said, his voice flat. "He has taken care of everything. You should be grateful for your brother's efforts." He could not look at me. In that moment, I knew he was a coward, and I was being sacrificed for his peace. The journey was a blur of train carriages and fog-shrouded docks. Julian escorted me to the ship himself, a grand gesture of his magnanimity. He handed me a ticket and a small purse of coins. "Be good, Clara," he said, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "And do try to write, though I imagine you'll be quite busy." As the ship pulled away from the gray shores of England, I felt a profound sense of desolation. The family I was supposedly meeting was not there to greet me. Instead, I was shown to a small, isolated cabin by two large, silent men who answered none of my questions. The door was locked from the outside. That was when the cold knot of dread in my stomach began to unravel into pure, unadulterated terror. For days I was kept in that cabin, fed simple meals by a stewardess with pity in her eyes, who refused to speak to me. The hope that this was all a terrible mistake slowly died, replaced by a certainty that was too monstrous to fully comprehend. The truth was delivered to me not in words, but in an act of casual cruelty. A few days before we reached our destination, one of the silent men brought me a package. Inside was a gown of shimmering, translucent silk and a set of delicate golden chains for my wrists and ankles. There was no note. None was needed. I was not a governess. I was cargo. My brother hadn't found me a position. He had sold me. The floor of the cabin seemed to fall away, and I was tumbling into an abyss of despair so profound it stole the air from my lungs. The memory of Alistair Finch's respectful gaze in the conservatory felt like a message from a different lifetime, a ghost of a person I was no longer. The ship sailed on, carrying me towards the glittering ancient city of Constantinople, a place I had once dreamed of seeing, now transformed into the geography of my personal hell. The first sight of Constantinople was a cruel masterpiece. Minarets pierced a sky the color of a faded sapphire, and the sun glittered on the waters of the Golden Horn. It was a city from one of my books, a dreamscape of impossible beauty that now served as the backdrop for my nightmare. I was taken from the ship, veiled and bundled into a closed carriage, and transported through bustling streets filled with sounds and smells that were both intoxicating and terrifying. The carriage passed through a series of towering gates, each one a further step into a world from which there was no return. We stopped before the walls of a palace that seemed less like a building and more like a fortress of marble and gold. This was the seraglio of Pasha Murad, my new home, my prison. The world inside was a labyrinth of opulent courtyards, trickling fountains and hushed corridors. The air was heavy with the scent of jasmine, rosewater, and something else, a faint, cloying smell of gilded decay and quiet desperation. I was handed over to the chief eunuch, a man named Kasim, whose face was a mask of impassive authority and whose eyes missed nothing. He looked me over with the same appraising glance as the pasha, but his was the look of a zookeeper assessing new and troublesome livestock. He spoke to me in surprisingly good English. "You will learn the rules here, English girl," he said, his voice soft but resonant with absolute power. "There is order, there is obedience. If you embrace these, you may find a certain comfort. If you defy them, you will find only pain." Life in the harem was a clockwork of suffocating routine. We were woken before dawn, bathed, perfumed, and dressed in silks that felt like a second skin. Our days were filled with lessons in music, dance, and poetry, arts intended not for our own enrichment, but for the pleasure of one man. We were a collection of beautiful objects, butterflies pinned to a board, and our value was measured only in our novelty and our ability to please the pasha. The other women were from every corner of the empire and beyond. Circassians with eyes like emeralds, fiery Georgians, melancholic Persians. Some, like me, were new and terrified. Others had been there for years, their spirits either broken into a state of listless resignation or sharpened into a weapon of cunning and jealousy. Rivalries were vicious and alliances were fragile, all revolving around the single gravitational pull of the pasha's favor. One of the older women, a quiet Circassian named Zara, who had been in the harem for a decade, took a cautious pity on me. She saw the unbroken defiance in my eyes and knew it would get me hurt. One afternoon, as we sat embroidering silk cushions, she spoke to me in a low whisper. "He does not like tears," she said, her fingers never stopping their work, "and he despises fear. It bores him. Your only armor here is a quiet mind. Watch everything. Learn the rhythms of this place. The guards' shifts, the delivery schedules for the kitchens, the old servant passages. Knowledge is the only key that might one day fit a lock." Pasha Murad himself was a specter of refined cruelty. He would summon me occasionally, not for the reasons I dreaded most, but to talk. He had learned of my English education from Julian, and found it amusing. He would have me read English poetry to him, his dark eyes watching me over a cup of thick, sweet coffee. He would ask my opinions on art and politics, listening with an indulgent smile, as if a dog had learned to recite Shakespeare. It was a game, a way to remind me that my mind, the one thing I considered my own, was just another of his possessions, a toy to be played with. "Your brother told me you had a quick intellect," he mused one evening, trailing a finger along the spine of a book. "He was quite eager to share your talents. He said you were wasted in the London fog, that you would bloom in the sun." The casual mention of Julian was like a physical blow, a reminder of the hand that had pushed me into this abyss. I would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I learned to school my features into a mask of polite neutrality, to keep my voice even, to meet his gaze without flinching. Inside, I was a storm of rage and despair, but on the surface, I was calm. I took Zara's advice to heart. My mind became a sponge. I memorized the lattice work of corridors, the scent of the spices that meant the kitchens were near, the sound of the guards' boots on the marble floors. I learned a few words of Turkish from the other women, enough to understand snippets of conversation. And every night, in the suffocating silence of the sleeping chambers, I would conjure the memory of the conservatory in London. I would replay my conversation with Lord Alistair Finch, a man who had spoken to me as an equal. That memory was my secret rebellion, a tiny, unquenchable flame of who I used to be. Meanwhile, a world away, and yet only a few miles across the city, Alistair Finch was settling into his new post at the British Embassy in Constantinople. The assignment was a significant step in his career, placing him at the heart of the complex, delicate dance of diplomacy between the British and Ottoman empires. He was, as always, meticulous and dedicated. his days filled with dispatches, negotiations, and the endless subtle maneuvering of international politics. He was a man who believed in the power of order, that civilization was a fragile structure built on rules, treaties, and protocol. The chaos of human emotion was a variable to be controlled and minimized. He remembered the girl from the conservatory. Of course, the encounter had been a brief, pleasant anomaly in a predictable evening. He had been struck by her intelligence, a sharp, inquisitive mind trapped behind a veil of shyness. He'd felt a pang of something akin to pity for her, stuck with that boorish brother. He had thought of her once or twice, a fleeting memory of a serious conversation amidst a sea of frivolity, and had idly hoped she found some measure of happiness. He had no reason to believe her fate was in any way connected to his new posting. The first whisper came to him in the Grand Bazaar. He was there not as a tourist, but to discreetly meet an informant, a dealer in carpets and secrets. As they haggled over a silk hirique, the informant, a man named Yusuf, lowered his voice. "The Pasha has a new prize in his collection," he murmured, his eyes flicking towards the entrance of the bazaar. "They say she is an English rose, pale and quiet, with a mind as sharp as a vizier's, a rare find." Alistair felt a prickle of distaste. The Pasha's appetites were well known and were a source of frequent, unofficial diplomatic headaches. But an Englishwoman? It was highly unusual and dangerous. Most likely, she was a dancer or an adventuress who had found her way into the Pasha's orbit willingly. He dismissed it as sordid gossip, but the whisper followed him. A few weeks later, at a dinner with a French diplomat, the topic of Pasha Murad's extravagance came up, and his latest acquisition. The Frenchman had boomed, swirling his wine. "An English girl, I hear, bought and paid for right out of London." Can you imagine the scandal if the Times got hold of that? This time, the word bought snagged in Alistair's mind. It was one thing for a woman to choose that life. It was another entirely for her to be sold. A cold, unpleasant feeling began to take root. He started to make quiet, careful inquiries, using the vast and subtle network of information available to a man in his position. He put his most trusted local aide, a sharp young man named Cale, on the task. "I need to know about the Pasha's new Englishwoman," he'd said, his voice neutral. "Her name, her origins. Be discreet." The pieces began to fall into place with chilling precision. Cale's contacts confirmed the presence of an English girl who had arrived several months ago. She was kept in strict seclusion. No one knew her name, only that she had come on a ship from England around the time of the Pasha's last visit there. Alistair's mind, trained to see patterns and connections, went back to the ball. He remembered her name, Clara Hemlock. He remembered her odious half-brother Julian. On a hunch, he sent a coded cable to a colleague in the Foreign Office in London, requesting a discreet financial background check on Julian Hemlock. The reply came a week later. Julian Hemlock, a man known for his significant gambling debts, had suddenly come into a large, unexplained sum of money several months prior, shortly after Pasha Murad had left London. The money had settled all his accounts. Alistair sat in his office, the dispatch in his hand, the city's sounds filtering through the open window. The pieces were no longer just pieces. They formed a picture of unimaginable depravity. The conversation in the conservatory, her intelligent eyes, her fascination with this very city, and her brother, that sneering brute, selling her like livestock to settle a card debt. It wasn't just a diplomatic incident waiting to happen, it was a profound personal violation of every principle Alistair held dear. The order he believed in had been perverted. A human being, a bright and thoughtful young woman, had been traded for coin. A cold, precise rage, unlike any emotion he had ever allowed himself to feel, settled over him. For the first time in his life, protocol was not the answer. It was the cage. He knew, with absolute certainty, that official channels were useless. An appeal to the Pasha would be met with denial and insult. An appeal to the Sultan would be buried in bureaucracy and might even be seen as an act of aggression. The Foreign Office would order him to do nothing, to sacrifice one citizen for the sake of a fragile treaty. They would write her off. He was alone in this. The man who had spent his entire adult life upholding the rules was about to break every single one of them. The decision was not agonizing. It was instantaneous. It felt like the only logical, sane response to an insane situation. He would get her out. He began to think not as a diplomat, but as a strategist planning an impossible campaign. He needed a team. He couldn't use embassy staff. They were too visible, too loyal to the crown. He needed people from the city's shadows, people who were deniable, who understood the city's secret workings. Through Kale, he found them. The first was an old Greek cartographer named Nikos, a man who had been dismissed from the Sultan's service for drunkenness, but who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the palace's forgotten architecture, including the ancient sewer and water systems that ran beneath it like a hidden river. The second was a woman, a formidable Armenian merchant named Anahid, who ran the palace's supply of exotic spices. She had access to the kitchens and the trust of the servants, a network of information that ran on whispers and bribes. The final piece was a former janissary, a man named Iskander, who had been part of the disbanded elite guard. He was a mountain of quiet muscle and tactical knowledge, a man who knew how the palace guards thought because he had been one of them. Alistair met them in a dusty back room of a coffee shop, the air thick with the smell of roasting beans and tobacco. He laid out his plan, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man briefing his cabinet, not a group of misfits and mercenaries. He spoke of routes, timings, distractions, and contingencies. He offered them a sum of money that would change their lives, but he also offered them something more. To Nikos, a chance to prove his forgotten knowledge was still valuable. To Anahid, revenge against a eunuch who had cheated her. To Iskander, a chance to fight for something just one last time. He saw the doubt in their eyes, the sheer audacity of the plan. Raiding the Pasha's private seraglio was a death sentence. Why? Iskander finally asked, his voice a low rumble. Why does the English lord risk his neck for one girl? Alistair looked at the ex-soldier, his own face a mask of diplomatic calm, but his eyes held a fire they had never seen. Because, Alistair said, his voice dropping even lower, my government has forgotten that its first duty is to its people. I have not. There was a long silence, and then one by one they nodded. The heist was on. Alistair returned to his residence, the proper English diplomat once more, but inside, a new and dangerous part of him had awoken. He was risking his career, his freedom, his life, and the delicate peace between two empires, all for the memory of a 20-minute conversation about Iznik pottery. It was, by any rational measure, an act of madness, and it felt like the most logical thing he had ever done. The night chosen for the escape was the eve of the Pasha's birthday, a lavish celebration that would consume the palace in a whirlwind of music, food, and spectacle. It was the perfect cover. Alistair, in his official capacity, had arranged a special gift from the British delegation, a magnificent fireworks display, to be launched from a barge anchored in the Bosphorus, directly in front of the palace's sea-facing walls. It was an extravagant, slightly ostentatious gesture, perfectly in character for a diplomat currying favor. In reality, it was the overture to his private war, a carefully timed series of explosions designed to draw every eye in the palace towards the water and away from the shadows. The most delicate part of the plan was getting a message to me. This fell to Anahid, the spice merchant. For weeks, she had cultivated a friendship with one of the younger, more sympathetic kitchen maids who sometimes served in the harem. A small pouch of rare saffron, a whispered word of praise, a shared complaint about the heat. These were the threads she wove into a bond of trust. The day before the heist, a small, hollowed-out pomegranate was delivered with the day's fruit. Inside, nestled in the crimson seeds, was a tightly rolled piece of parchment. The maid, her hand trembling, slipped it to me as she cleared away a dish. My heart hammered against my ribs as I secreted it away. Later, in the privacy of the bathing chambers, I unrolled it. The script was small and precise. It read, "Midnight. The northern fountain, cause a disturbance. A friend from the conservatory waits." The conservatory. It could only be one person. A dizzying, impossible wave of hope washed over me, so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. It wasn't a dream. He had remembered. He was coming. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but for the first time in months, it was joined by a fierce, burning resolve. As evening fell, the palace thrummed with energy. Music drifted from the main courtyards, and the scent of roasting lamb filled the air. Inside the harem, the atmosphere was one of excited anticipation. The women were adorned in their finest silks and jewels, hoping to catch the pasha's eye. I, on the other hand, was a coiled spring of anxiety. My role was crucial. I needed to create a diversion significant enough to draw the attention of Qasim, the chief eunuch, and the guards under his command. My target was Isla, a notoriously proud and hot-tempered Georgian who saw me as a rival. As the hour approached midnight, I took a deep breath and walked towards her, accidentally on purpose stumbling and spilling a cup of sherbet down the front of her prized silk gown. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. Isla let out a shriek of rage, leaping to her feet. Her accusations, in a torrent of Turkish and Georgian, filled the air. I responded with feigned clumsiness and apologies that only seemed to fuel her fury. The other women gathered around, some egging her on, others watching with detached amusement. It was exactly the chaos I needed. Qasim and two of his guards stormed into the chamber, their faces thunderous. As they began to pull us apart, their attention entirely focused on the screaming match, I knew this was my only chance. In the confusion, I slipped away, melting into the shadows of the corridor, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Beneath the palace, in the suffocating darkness, Alistair and his team were moving. Nikos, the old cartographer, led them through a network of ancient water channels, his memory of the old maps flawless. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and decay, and the sound of their footsteps echoed unnervingly in the enclosed space. Iskander moved with a silent, predatory grace, while Alistair, unused to such filth and exertion, focused on putting one foot in front of the other, his diplomatic suit now stained with grime. They emerged as planned, through a loose grate in the floor of a disused spice pantry, mere feet from the harem's kitchen gardens. The first firework exploded over the Bosphorus, a shower of gold and crimson that lit up the night sky and was met with a chorus of oohs and ahs from the partygoers. The distraction had begun. Iskander silently disabled, the lone guard patrolling the garden path, leaving him bound and gagged in the bushes. They moved swiftly towards the northern courtyard, where a small fountain bubbled in the moonlight. I was already there, hiding behind a marble column, my entire body trembling. I saw a shadow detach itself from the deeper darkness of a cypress tree. It was him, Alistair. His face was grim, streaked with dirt, but his eyes were the same, calm, serious, and focused entirely on me. There was no time for words. He simply held out his hand. The moment my fingers touched his, a jolt of certainty went through me. I was no longer alone. He gave my hand a brief, firm squeeze, a gesture that conveyed more than 1,000 words of reassurance, and then we were moving. Our retreat was not as clean as our approach. As we slipped back towards the pantry, a guard returning from an unscheduled break rounded a corner, his lantern held high. His eyes widened in shock as he saw our small group, a veiled woman being hurried along by 3 men, where none should be, before he could even open his mouth to shout. Iskander was on him, a blur of motion that ended with the guard slumping to the ground, unconscious. but the lantern had crashed to the flagstones, the sound of shattering glass unnaturally loud in the relative quiet. We scrambled back into the tunnels, Alistair practically pulling me through the grate, just as we heard the first raised shouts of alarm from the courtyard above. The escape through the sewers was a frantic, desperate scramble. The shouts from above grew fainter, but we could hear the sounds of pursuit echoing in the tunnels behind us. The clang of steel, the splash of boots in the fetid water, the grand finale of the fireworks display was erupting above, the percussive booms a counterpoint to the frantic beating of my own heart, masking the sounds of our flight. We burst out of a grate at the base of the sea wall, the cool, salty air, a shocking relief after the stale darkness of the tunnels. A small, unassuming fishing boat, manned by Cale, was bobbing in the gentle waves, hidden in the shadow of the palace wall. We tumbled aboard, and Cale immediately cut the mooring line, grabbing the oars and pulling us away into the dark waters of the Bosphorus. As we slipped out into the open water, the last firework, a magnificent weeping willow of silver sparks, exploded directly overhead, illuminating Alistair's exhausted, triumphant face. He had done it. The Diplomat had staged a prison break from the most secure fortress in the Empire. We were out. We were free, but the danger was far from over. The aftermath in Constantinople was a diplomatic inferno. The disappearance of an Englishwoman from the Pasha's private, impenetrable harem was an unprecedented insult. Pasha Murad was apoplectic with rage. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that the British were involved. The timing of the gift of fireworks was too perfect, too convenient. He lodged a furious official protest with the British ambassador, accusing the embassy of orchestrating a vile kidnapping. The ambassador, a man who prized stability above all else, was horrified. An emergency meeting was called. Alistair sat at the polished mahogany table, the very picture of a concerned but baffled diplomat. He was clean-shaven, his suit was impeccable, and his expression was one of grave concern. He calmly and logically dissected the Pasha's claims, pointing out the lack of evidence, the absurdity of the accusation. While the disappearance of any British subject is a matter of utmost seriousness, he stated, his voice the epitome of reason, to suggest that Her Majesty's government would engage in such a reckless, swashbuckling act of aggression is, with all due respect, fanciful. It would risk a trade relationship that is vital to both our empires. He was using the very tools of his trade, logic, protocol, and condescension to cover the greatest breach of protocol he had ever committed. He was walking the finest of tightropes, deflecting suspicion, managing the crisis, and praying his deception would hold. While Lord Finch played the part of the dutiful diplomat, I was hidden away in the city he was so skillfully manipulating. I was in a small, clean room in Anahid's house, deep within the winding streets of the Armenian Quarter. For the first time in months, I could breathe. The silks and perfumes of the harem were replaced by the simple scent of linen and baking bread. I was safe, but I was also a ghost, unable to step outside, a secret that could still bring disaster upon us all. Alistair would visit after dark, arriving in a nondescript carriage, his face etched with the strain of his double life. It was in that small, quiet room that we had our first real conversation since the conservatory. I tried to find the words to thank him, but they felt so small, so inadequate for the magnitude of what he had done. "You risked everything," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Why?" He sat opposite me, a cup of mint tea steaming untouched in his hands. He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze steady. "I have spent my life in service to a system," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "A system of rules and agreements designed to prevent chaos. But that system failed you. It allowed you to be treated as a commodity. When a system produces an outcome that is a moral monstrosity, adherence to that system is no longer a virtue, it is complicity." He took a sip of his tea. "I did not do it for the crown or the empire. I did it because it was the only action that made sense in a world that had ceased to make sense. In those clandestine meetings we learned about each other. He spoke of his rigid upbringing, his belief in order, and the strange, unsettling satisfaction he felt in having shattered it for a just cause. I spoke of my life before, of my dreams of independence, of the crushing weight of my family's indifference. A bond was forged between us, a profound connection built not on romance, but on a shared secret, on mutual respect, and on the quiet understanding of a debt that could never truly be repaid. After 2 weeks of tense diplomatic wrangling and covert planning, Alistair decided it was time. The Pasha's fury had not abated, and the city was no longer safe for me. He had arranged passage on a Genoese merchant ship bound for Trieste. From there I could make my way back to England. He provided me with a new set of papers, a new name, and a heavy purse filled with enough money to start a new life. He could not come with me. He had to stay, to continue managing the fallout, to ensure the incident faded into the realm of rumor and unproven accusation. Our farewell took place on a wind-swept pre-dawn dock. The city was just beginning to wake, the call to prayer echoing faintly across the water. The air was cold, and I clutched the simple wool cloak he had given me. "I will not return to my father's house," I told him, my voice firm. "The person who lived there is gone." He nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Good. She deserves better." He pressed the purse of money into my hand. "This is not charity, Miss Hemlock. It is restitution for what was stolen from you. Use it to build a life of your own choosing." The formality of his words, the use of my surname, felt like a shield for the deeper emotions swirling between us. "Will I ever see you again, my lord?" I asked, the question hanging in the salty air. He looked out at the water, towards the distant shores of Europe. "My career, I suspect, has been irrevocably complicated by this affair, but I have no regrets." He finally turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something deeply personal in his eyes, a profound vulnerability. "Live well, Clara," he said, his voice quiet. "That will be the only justification I need." With a final brief nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the labyrinthine streets of Constantinople, leaving me at the edge of a new and utterly unknown life. As the ship pulled away from the shore, I did not look back. I looked forward, towards the horizon. I never set foot in my father's house again. The name Clara Hemlock was left behind on that dock in Constantinople, a ghost to haunt the family that had discarded her. With the money Alistair had given me, I became Clara Morgan. I did not return directly to London, but spent a year in Florence, immersing myself in the art that had once been my only escape. I learned the language, studied the business of art, and slowly, painstakingly, began to build a new identity, one forged by my own hands. When I finally returned to London, it was not as a victim, but as an entrepreneur. I used the remainder of the funds to lease a small but well-located shop and opened a gallery specializing in prints and watercolors. It was a modest start, but it was mine. The work was hard, the days were long, and there were times I was so lonely. The ache was a physical thing, but the freedom was intoxicating. Every book I bought, every meal I ate, every decision I made was my own. I was beholden to no one. Word of my fate, or rather, the lack of it, trickled back to me through gossip. The official story was that I had tragically perished of a fever in Smyrna. My father and Beatrice had performed a convincing pantomime of grief. But the whispers of the truth, the story the French diplomat had found so amusing, never entirely went away. It became a quiet scandal that clung to the Hemlock name like a bad smell, tarnishing their reputation. Julian, without a sister to sell, had no way to pay his ever-growing debts. His creditors eventually closed in, and the family was forced to sell the grand townhouse. They retreated to a small, dreary cottage in the countryside, their social standing in ruins. I felt no pity, only a distant, cold sense of justice. As for Pasha Murad, I read in a newspaper years later that he had been on the losing side of a political coup within the Sultan's court, and had been exiled to a remote island, his power and his collection of beautiful things stripped away from him. 5 years after I had sailed from Constantinople, the bell above my gallery door chimed. I looked up from a ledger, a polite smile, ready for a customer. The man standing there was older, his hair now flecked with gray at the temples. He was dressed in a simple tweed jacket, not the severe suit of a diplomat, but the posture was the same, ramrod straight, and the eyes were unmistakable. It was Alistair. My heart stopped for a moment, then began to beat in a slow, heavy rhythm. He stood there, just inside the door, looking around at my small, successful world. He looked at the paintings on the wall, at the neat stacks of prints, and finally at me. "Miss Morgan, I presume," he said, and for the first time I saw the ghost of a real smile touch his lips. "It seems you have lived well." His career, as he had predicted, had stalled. The Constantinople incident was never proven, but the suspicion hung over him, a black mark on his perfect record. He had served out a few more years in a series of unglamorous, dead-end postings before finally taking an early retirement. He had chosen a person over a policy, and the system had never forgiven him for it. We talked for hours that afternoon, closing the gallery to the public. We spoke of the intervening years, of the lives we had built separately. The unspoken feelings that had been buried under layers of danger and protocol in that small room in the Armenian Quarter finally had the space to surface. It wasn't a sudden, passionate reunion. It was something quieter, deeper, and more profound. It was a recognition of two people who had been irrevocably changed by the same crucible, who understood a part of each other that no one else in the world could. He had rescued me from a prison of silk and gold, but in doing so, he had also rescued himself from a prison of rules and regulations. We found in each other a quiet harbor, a partnership built on a foundation of the most extraordinary trust. Looking back now, I understand that my cruel half-brother did me a strange and terrible favor. By selling me, he forced me to discover a strength I never knew I possessed. He thought my value was something that could be bartered for, a sum of money to cover his debts. What he failed to understand, and what Alistair always saw, was that a person's worth is not a currency to be traded. It is a fire within. Sometimes that fire is banked low, hidden away for fear of being extinguished, but it is always there, and sometimes it takes the most unlikely person, breaking all their own rules, to give it the oxygen it needs to burn brightly once more. The greatest lesson I learned is that the family you are born into does not have the final say on who you are. True family are the people who see your fire, and instead of trying to put it out, they hand you a match. Have you ever had someone believe in you when no one else would? Share your story in the comments below. I'd be honored to read it. And please, don't forget to like this video if my journey resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories of survival and finding your own strength. Thank you for joining me today. Remember that your worth is inherent, and you should never let anyone else set the price.